Okay. Good evening, everyone. We are going to get started. Thank you all for joining for our second and last session or class on this topic of discussing Israel and all that comes along with it. So we're going to continue our conversation. We started last week, which thank God got very good feedback. I know people really enjoyed it. I know I myself enjoyed it. And discussing how Israel can properly defend themselves. Yes. So last week we discussed about the security measures. They say, and this is actually a true story. They say after 1967, the media was speaking to a Israeli general, one of the generals of the 60 War, and they asked him, "How do you explain the victory of the 60 War?" And he said, "There is a natural way of explaining it and a supernatural way of explaining it." He said the natural way of explaining it is that it was a miracle. The supernatural way is that we had intelligence in the military. This I don't remember. I don't remember who was the general who said this, but this was a real interview. So yes, ultimately we do believe that our protection comes from Israel's protection comes from Hashem, and ultimately there's godly protection over. We just read in this past week's Torah portion, in this past Shabbos, that Hashem's eyes are on this land, beginning of the year to the end of the year, and there is divine protection. That being said, obviously, as we're discussing, God wants us to work through channels of nature, and therefore, in the Torah, Hashem gives us the method how to be able to be strong, and that is what we're discussing in last week and this week again. But because we believe our protection ultimately starts with the divine intervention, we're going to start off, as we do every time, with a chapter of Tehillim, a chapter of Psalms, with the prayer for our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael. Mizmor LeDavid, Adonai Roy Lo Yachzor. Vidnos Dasha. What? Yes. Vidnos Dasha Yariteni Almeid Menuches Yinahaleini. Nafshi Yeshova Yamcheni B'mad B'tzadek L'man Shemo. Gam Ki Elach V'Yes Amavis Lo Irara Ki Ati Madi Shivtecha V'Shnatecha Heima Yinachamuni. Parech L'fanei Shulchan Negetzari Dishanta V'Sheman Reishi Kais Ravayam. Just an aside, I remember listening to a video of one of the hostages who was released and said that this chapter of Tehillim was so powerful for her. While she was there, she kept on saying, even when I go in the shadow of death, I recognize God is with me. She said this is what gave her strength throughout her time in Gaza while she was kept hostage. So may Hashem bring protection, especially those who are still in Gaza, as hostages, and may Hashem protect all our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael. Amen. Amen. Okay, so as I mentioned last week, we spoke about Israel's security and the three major points. The three major points we discussed was as follows. The first thing is to preempt when you know that there is a threat, to preemptively go and take out the threat before they could attack you. We mentioned this is an idea in the Talmud. When someone is out to go to kill you, you have to preempt. This is not an option. This is an obligation. I appreciate whichever one of you went and told us to the Israel military this past week when they went and preemptively. And I think I know a few people texted me, emailed me, and people said this is so clear how the preemptive, again, they knew there was an attack happening at 5 o'clock a.m. I'm sure you read this, 4:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the attack was going to start. They were expecting hundreds and hundreds of rockets at Tel Aviv. And they took it out. And what the attack that actually did happen was tiny in comparison. I don't believe there was anyone that was killed in this attack. There was. Oh, there was? There was? What? Okay, but from what could have happened. From what could have happened if they did not preemptively do this. And again, as we mentioned last week, This saves so many lives on both sides. This is not just we value human life, and this is the first and foremost consideration. And when we preemptively take on an attack, and we do this again and again, thank God they did this, but they have to keep on doing this because that is an act of deterrence. So this is the first. This is the first idea. The second idea we spoke about is, so again, the first one is when to start the war. The second one is when to end the war. When do you end the war? Only when all the objectives of the war were completed. As long as you're going to stop before you reach the objective and make a ceasefire, while many people intuitively think ceasefire is going to save lives, ceasefire before our military objectives are done causes lives to be lost in the long run. Because the same cycle, ceasefire, everyone could claim victory, they go rearm themselves, and that's what happened. And then the attack keeps happening. We spoke about so powerfully. This was a difference between World War I and World War II. World War I ended in a ceasefire and a truce. That caused that what? So I'm saying in World War I, it ended with a truce, and that caused Germany to be able to claim victory. They attacked in and therefore that caused World War II. World War II only ended when what's called unconditional surrender, when the troops marched through Berlin, and again, that caused World War I, the ceasefire, which many people may think of as being kind, that caused so many more millions and millions. I mean, obviously in Jewish history, look what happened, but even zooming out of Jewish, the Holocaust, how many, on the other side, German civilians were killed. So the second day of when do you end the war? Only when all the objectives are completed. And finally, the third important rule is when we're talking about strategic areas, or as we read in Halakha, this is Jewish law from thousands of years ago. When it comes to border nations, we go out to war, even if they're just saying it's for money matters. All the more so if it's talking about enemies, that we don't give up an inch, because every inch, every foot, every mile, especially when we're talking about a nation, a land which is as small as Israel, is so strategic, and it gives less time to defend themselves, less time for rockets, and ultimately, these are the three important principles we spoke about last week, how for Israel to protect itself. But moving on to this, we recognize that with all this being said, it's not so simple. It becomes a lot more complicated. And the reason for this is because there's also the messaging behind it. There's the PR. How do we message? How are we able to give across the message? Or in other words, we all know that one of the hardest things Israel faces is the international pressure from whether it's the UN, from the USA, from the world at large. And the question is, even if we recognize, we know what Israel has to do for its security, how are they able to navigate that with all the pressures they get? And hopefully once we discuss this will also give us a clue, also give us an idea. We speak about anti-Semitism, how it has reared its ugly head, especially it's always been there, it's always been a little bit open, maybe laying a little more dormant, and since October 7th, there's so much anti-Semitism, and hopefully, again, Rav is not going to cover everything, and it's obviously a very broad topic, but hopefully that will also help us, give us how we're supposed to project ourselves to the world. So, we're going to discuss three ideas tonight. First of all, Israel's message to the world. The second idea is Israel's message to the USA. We'll explain why there's a difference there. And the third one, Israel's message to itself, to its own people, to its students. Now, how do we start off this conversation? The first and most important topic to discuss when discussing our PR, if you want to call it, our messaging, is to discuss what is our right to this land. Why are we in Israel in the first place? Because again, before we start talking about defending our land, we have to put down why is it our land. That has to be the first thing that we discuss. So most secular Jewish people, you ask them, why is Israel our land? They'll say, because in 1948, Israel got independence. And the UN, the UN and the Balfour Declaration, and all because since then, We have a state since 1948. However, this is not such a simple response. Now, I'd advise against this, but I'm not sure. I'm guessing some of you may be in my boat. So I try not to do, but sometimes I do it anyways. Perhaps you've sometimes read comment threads on different, take a Washington Post news item about Israel, and then there's comment threads, thousands of comment threads, thousands of comments, people discussing it. And generally, I'll give you a typical conversation on these comment threads. And again, this is the message. This is what the world talks about. So you'll have poster number one will say, what? No, comments. People writing comments online. Comments. A comment thread. And the first poster will be, Israel is genocidal, a genocidal nation. It must be stopped. Right. Comment. Well, we'll get there. Comment number. The second poster will be like, genocide. Israel is acting in self-defense for October 7th. Poster A goes back. What do you mean? The word that it didn't start October 7th. October 7th, that was an act of resistance of Israel's occupation. Poster B will go then say, occupation. Israel is forced to occupy lands because they were being attacked. To which poster A will be saying, attack. That's because Israel is founded on the theft of Palestinian land. Remember the Nakba? And Palestinian will return once again from Israel to the sea. This is how typical going back and forth on these comment threads will happen. And many times, you end up seeing, unfortunately, is that the person defending Israel will kind of slink away, will not know necessarily how to respond to this. And the truth is, because once it's pointed out, in 1948, we stole Arab land. Then many people don't know how to respond to that. Because what is the typical talking points about why we have Israel? So many people will say the UN giving us independence. The Holocaust, because we were almost exterminated in the Holocaust, we were almost killed out in the Holocaust, we have to have a land. The British mandate, these are all typical ideas. And what is the response by the other people to all this? Who cares? Who cares that the UN decide to give you a place? What does the UN give that a right for you to have that place? And just because the Holocaust happened, that doesn't give you the right to steal someone else's land. And part of the reason, now I'm not saying, I'm not trying to say these responses are not good responses, 1948 and the UN, the Holocaust, but it's not the full truth. And that is why this messaging, for so many years, as long as Israel has been in existence, has not really been working, because it's not the full truth. And the first idea that we're going to discuss today is, if we want to be confident, if we want to be able to speak to the world about why Israel belongs to us, we can't start in 1948. And the idea is, the reason the land belongs to us is very simple. I think for most people who are in the room, but not necessarily for everyone, and that's because God gave us this land. We have it written down we have the receipts written in the bestseller, in the world's bestseller, the Bible, which all religions are based upon. Go into a church, go into a mosque, or go into your motel and find that book there. And what does it say over there? So I want you to open up your book and go to page 14. This will speak about our biblical bonds to this land. Again, there's different, it doesn't capture all of them, but there's some of them over here. I'm going to start with the first one, the original promise, and this is from Genesis, chapter 12. Abraham passed through the land until the site of Shem, reaching the plains of Moreh. The Canaanites were then in the land. Hashem appeared to Abraham and told him, I will give this land to your descendants. Moving on, I'll try to go through a little bit quicker. I know some of you guys don't have the book, so I'll try to read it out loud. The second one, also in Genesis, on that day, talking about the bris bein haBasarim, the covenant of the parts, Hashem makes a covenant with Abram as follows: to your descendants, I will give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Keni, Kenezi, Kanmoni, the lands of Hiti, Perisi, Arafam, the lands of the Mori, Kanani, Gerashi, Yebusi, and the burning bush again. I have descended to rescue the Jews from Egypt's grip and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the region of the Kanani, Hiti, Amori, Perisi, Hiti, and Yebusi. Again, now talking about the end of the 40 years, when they're about to enter the land. Moshe ascended from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of the summit that faces Jericho. God shows him the entire land, Gilgal until Dan, the entire region of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, the entire land of Judah until the western sea, the south, the plain, and the valley of Jericho, and the city of palm trees until Zoar. God then told him, this is the land regarding to which I swore to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, saying, I will give it to your offspring. I will let you view it with your own eyes, but you may not cross over here. These are just a sampling. I'm not going to read the rest of them. There's other texts over there. This is a sampling of different texts. And again, this is the receipts. This is the strongest, this is our strongest claim to the land. There are billions of people in this world that believe in the Bible, believe in whatever you want to call it, the Torah, the Bible, the First Testament, whatever you want to call it. All major religions are based upon this. And this thousands of years ago, we have our claim to this land. There is no other nation in this land, in this world, that has such a strong and old ancient claim to their land like we do. What is America's claim to our land? You go back a couple hundred years. Over here, we have the receipts, and we were able to trace it all the way back. All the way back. There's no period of Jewish history where Jews were not living in Israel. All the way from when the Jewish people are promised land and go down into the land. Now, the problem of this is that we're scared to say the G word, the God word. You know, we're scared to say it to the world. We don't want to sound fanatical to the world. So what do we use? So I agree. So what do we use? We use the UN. We use other ideas. But again, that's not the full truth, and that's why it has not been penetrated. And the weakest thing we could say is that Israel was established, our claim to the land is established since 1948. That's giving us less than 80 years. People in this room have a longer claim to life than Israel. It's 1948. Our claim goes way beyond 1948. You know what our claim goes to? The original 1948. You know what 1948, the original 1948 is? The year in the Jewish calendar, 1948 is the year Abraham is born. Abraham was born in 1948 from creation. And this is our strongest claim. Again, we could tell them, look at your own book. The only question is, do we have the guts to say it? Because if we're able to say it confidently, and we're going to get to the messaging aspect in a moment, but if we're able to say it confidently, and then there is no other place that has the claim like we do. Again, this is the world's bestseller going back thousands of years. Now, where do we see this idea? This idea was expressed 1700 years ago. So, I'm sure many of you have heard Rashi. Rashi is the foremost commentator on the Chumash. Any Chumash you open, any 5 books of Moses you open, any will have the Rashi commentary. Now, what is the first Rashi? The first Rashi in the whole Torah. On the Bereshis Bara Elokim, God created the fact that God created this world. God created the heavens and the earth. Rashi says, the first Rashi in the whole Torah says this idea. It almost sounds like Rashi is speaking today. Again, exactly what's happening today in the world. What does Rashi say? So take a look at text number 2. This is coming from Rabbi Yitzchak. Rashi quotes Rabbi Yitzchak, who says as follows. Rabbi Yitzchak said, text number 2, page 17. Rabbi Yitzchak said, the Torah ought to have began with the verse, this month shall be for you, etc. The first month commandment to the people. Why then does it begin with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth? What is Rabbi Yitzchak asking? Rabbi Yitzchak is asking a very simple question. Why does the Torah start with creation? Now, to some, this seems like a very obvious answer. That is the beginning. But Torah is not a history book. Torah is not just telling us things that happen. There's so much parts of history which Torah does not tell us. What is Torah? Torah is a guide for life. Torah is telling us how to live a life. So why does it make a difference that God created the world in the first day? What does that have to do with us? Again, Torah should start off with the first mitzvah. So wherever the first mitzvah is, that's where the Torah should start. Because the Torah is ultimately about how to live a life. We have to know about 6 days of creation. So mention creation when we speak about the mitzvah of Shabbos. Why speak about creation on its own? So what does he say? Again, 1,700 years ago, but he could have been speaking to the BBC today. The strength of his work, he relates to his people to give them the inheritance of the nation. If the nations of the world will say to Israel, you are thieves for having conquered the land of the 7 nations, Israel will reply, the entire world is God's. He created it and granted it to whomever he desired. It was his will to give it to the 7 nations, and it was his will to take it from them and give it to us. Again, 1,700 years ago, Rav Yitzchak saying this idea. Again, these same words could be said today, because this is the story of the Jewish people and Israel. Again, this is the beginning of our documentation. The question is, are we going to use this response? Because we do not have the moral high ground if we start using 1948 as our response. And here's where the real kicker is. We don't necessarily have to convince the world. And I'm sure many of you are thinking, the world won't be impressed by that, or not everyone believes in God. The main thing is that we should be confident about. If we are convinced about this, if we are confident about this truth, then we will be respected. As long as we start equivocating, 1948, this, that, then that's what gives them ground to push back. But once you show a confidence, I know this belongs to me. This not inherently belongs to us. That's when, if someone asks you, what are you doing in your house? And you say, what do you mean? It's my parents' house, my grandparents' house. No one's going to start questioning you. When you start, giving your wishy-washy answers, that's when it gives them place to say, genocidal occupation. And we have to be secure about our belonging there. And this is my own thoughts. I'm not going to say this for sure, but my own thoughts are, I think this might be the reason why, unfortunately, so many Jewish youth today, unfortunately, on the campuses join the anti-Israel protests. And why is this? Again, this is my thoughts. Because they were fed the 1948, and they weren't convinced by that. They were told, what I mean, there's before 1948. They weren't convinced by that, and therefore they think, again, these are misguided. They're not bad people. These were misguided, and they think Israel doesn't have a right to be there. If they were told and if they were taught the real truth of our claims to the land, I think, I'm not going to speak for everyone, but I think so many of them would be able to have this confidence. And that's what's lacking in the Jewish people today. And unfortunately, this is part of who we are. We're always feeling guilty, and always, I've said this before, but they say about the army, in the army where you have the major calling up three soldiers. One says, "What's your name?" O'Donnell. What religion are you? Christian. Okay, Christian. Second one, what's your name? Ryan. Muslim. Third one, what's your name? Goldstein. What religion are you? Well, I don't really know. You must be Jewish. Unfortunately, as Jewish people, we're constantly scared of our own shadow. And this is, we've been hiding this for so long. I want to start off with the first video, which the Rebbe really speaks about this idea.
Und nicht mit Sonnen Gold, und die Bibel bestimmen, und die Jungen von Stammermann, die Teilung haben verkehrt, die selbstverständlichen Menschen, die der Leute zerdicken, die auch so eine Schule, die Bibel hat geschaut, und die Bauern haben das Schulen, da ist einfach Bühnen auf Liton, an alle die Kriege, hat doch und das Sonnen gemacht. Und so selbst gesagt, that there is there, as well as all that we found and taken the Lord and agreed, was detained in Lord's law heaven, who detained in Lord from the heavens and Lord, Und ich lebe so am Gesicht in der Licht. Und wenn ich mir nicht mal sehe, wir werden Menschen an der Hitze werden mit anderen Unionen, wo die Gute kamen kommen, an der Delta Vergober nicht mehr alle Feinde tun, was wir die Konstanten noch nicht. Entonces, the einzige Teile, was die dichte Chancen dazu sagen.
Okay, so this is the first and most important, and the first idea when we're speaking about our messaging. And again, I want to stress this again. This is less for the world. Again, it's for the world as well. And so many people, again, I walked on the street, and as I've said before, I'm not sure how, but they recognize that I'm Jewish. And so many times people tell us, listen, we recognize your land. God gave it to you in the Bible. But if we are strong with our own messaging, we have our own confidence, so many times the issues that pop up will not pop up in the message. But here's the next idea we have to discuss, and here's the next big question. What do we do? What does Israel do when facing pressure? The idea of facing international pressure is as old as 1948. This is a part and parcel of Israel being a state, being a country. There is that pressure from all over. And there's pressure from the world, there's pressure from America, there's different types of pressure. Sometimes the pressure is, again, give up some land. Sometimes the pressure is ceasefire. Sometimes the pressure is, do this, meet with this person. And there's all different types of pressures. And here's weird. Let's go back to last week. Let's go back to last week's discussion. The most important consideration will always be and always have to be that what is going to be there to maximize life. Anything else has to be a non-starter. Anything else, we can't make concessions to make other people happy, even though if it may endanger other people. Now I recognize it's easier said than done. And it's not an easy thing. And again, it's not about judging anyone, judging any person. I'm not envious for anyone that has to make these decisions. But the truth is, and we'll watch it in a video, a moment where we speak about this so often. The truth is, and this is the truth to human nature, this is physics, that once you start conceding, what happens? There's more pressure to concede more. Let's speak about gravity. Once something starts buckling a little bit, it buckles a little more and more. As soon as you start showing weakness, then, even if it's subconsciously, then it's being picked up on, and more pressure is given. If you're able to stand strong, then you will have less pressure. So it may seem harder in the moment to stand strong. I'm getting so much pressure, but recognize when you give in, the pressure is not going to stop. You give in an inch, you bend a little bit, they'll ask you to bend a little bit more. The pressure is never going to stop. The only way it will stop, or the only way it will get less, is if it's recognized that they're not willing to bend on their security measures. And this is the next important thing. Again, it's not about judging, it's not about, but this is speaking about what is the most effective way to keep our security is by recognizing that showing weakness is not going to help us. It may make the person feel good in the moment, but ultimately will lead to further concessions and further pressure that will take place. Let's take a look at the next video, which speaks about, again, the danger of giving in to international pressure.
Und die Bibel war nach noch, die Bibel haben so gerecht, der Junge so eng, nicht nur so sein Staat und die Chance noch dort werden gemacht, was mit der Beweisen der Gräste macht, für Aufnehmen der Zeug gestochen hat, nicht verstanden. Und nach ihm gekriegt, und dann den Tag gelegt, Want dat soort blijkbaar wiezen met zwemmen naar huizen. En nu komt als ze wonen als zwemmen om nemen. Wat het als die toon, aan derde zijn alle die toeien wat de maakt nodig. Is niet der bier. Und das haben Nente gemacht, die Schollen, ja, der Wiete, noch gemacht, den Zag, was hat mir Bate gesagt.
So again, we're saying a very basic idea, and this is a human nature. The more someone recognizes there's a certain weakness, anytime you're having two conflicting people or two conflicting nations, and you're trying to make some sort of compromise, the pressure is always going to be more on the person that shows weakness. And that's why Israel, throughout its history, has been getting so much pressure. Why? Because Israel has always been conceding. There's always been, again, we speak about ceasefires, and every time, again, hopefully there'll be a change this time. But the past 20 years, every time there's been a round of attacks. So ultimately, there's pressure on Israel, ceasefire. And again, I'm not even saying the pressure is coming from a bad place. It may be well-meaning, but it's against Israel's security interests. And as we spoke about last week, it causes more loss of life on each side. But because they've given in, people recognize Israel gives in. Israel shows weakness. Let's pressure them again. So the first and most important idea is, so let's think about the two steps. The first is we have to have that internal confidence that the land belongs to us. Not because of only 1948. Again, that's another reason. I'm not dismissing that, but it goes way beyond 1948. And the next step is, once we have that, then we have to remain strong in the face of pressure. Now, yeah. So I'm going to speak about that in a moment. Again, because actually it's interesting. I never did just speak about that with regards to Israel. I never spoke about that with regards to America, but I'll get to that in a moment. So this is all good when it comes to the world, when it comes to how to address the world. But it gets a little bit more complicated. It gets a little bit more sticky when we're speaking about how, when it comes to pressure from America. And why is this? Pressure from the United States. Because the reality is that the U.S. is a vital ally to Israel. It gives billions of dollars. We have it provide security, loan agreements. Sometimes in the international arena, it gives it support in the UN. And now sometimes. So let's get there. So sometimes U.S. puts pressure on Israel. Now, and we'll give you money if you do A, B, and C. We'll give you a veto in the UN if you do A, B, and C. Now, here's where it becomes more complicated. Because as long as it's, the UN, as long as it's someone who's not necessarily giving us anything, so it's security versus compromise, security will always trump. Will always trump. This compromise will always be more important than the idea of, just because you want me to compromise, my security comes first. But when it comes to now, when discussing pressure from the U.S., it's security versus security. Because having backing from the U.S. is part of our security. Part of Israel's security is it relies on the U.S. for certain assurances. So now we can't just say, I don't want to listen to you, because that will come back to bite them. So now it becomes a lot more tricky to you to say, we're not going to listen to them at all. So which security do we prioritize? There's the security on the ground. We feel this is better for our security. But then there's the security U.S. is saying, do this. And they give us the support of billions of dollars. I'm sure many of you guys know this. One of the greatest inventions Israel has ever had is the Iron Dome. The Iron Dome has literally saved probably tens of thousands of lives. The truth is, a lot of the money, again, the technology was based in Israel, but a lot of the support, a lot of the money was funded by the U.S. So therefore, it's not so simple just to say, who cares what they say? Again, when it comes to the world, it's a lot easier. If you're not getting any support, you're not getting any security assurances, then it's easier to say my security comes before compromise. But when our pitted, security versus, the pressure, which also includes security. How do we navigate? So I want to bring up, again, it's not me, but this is 3 points which the Rebbe stressed. It comes from Torah. Obviously, this is not the Rebbe's ideas. All are based in Torah. And again, this is not covering everything. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated, and we'll address all the issues. But here are 3 general ideas to consider when Israel is being faced with the pressures. Point number 1 is that in the long run, and I know people will say, you can't really rely on this now, but in the long run, Israel needs to become less dependent on others, including the US. And if they would have done this earlier, a lot of issues could have been prevented. It's not good for Israel for all its eggs to be in one basket, because they should be self-sufficient. And they ever spoke about this often in the 80s, and go back to the oil. They ever actually, interestingly, they ever spoke about this, not just with regards to Israel. They ever spoke about this with regards to the US also. They ever said, why are we being reliant on Arab nations for our oil? We should be self-reliant. Many of these nations were relying on oil, meanwhile chanting death to Israel, death to America. For a nation to be strong, you have to become more and more self-reliant. And this idea, being able to, what? 100%, but the more, it doesn't mean completely moving away. But if we're so reliant on other nations, if Israel's so reliant, that is a hindrance to Israel. So the first idea is that Israel should be prioritizing as much as possible, because Israel has the ability to be more self-reliant than it is. So yes, getting money from nations is good, but that also often comes with strings attached. I'll give you the money if you do A, B, and C, which comes in the place of Israel's security. So this is the first idea. The first important idea to discuss is the idea that Israel, in its best interest, would be less reliant on world powers and the USA. But I think the second and third point are the more important ones. And the second point is that Israel should not be so afraid of the US, what it says and what it promises. And the reason for this is because the US also shifts its positions. It will say agreements, but that agreement will not always stand. Again, why? Because administrations change, facts on the grounds change, and therefore the U.S. ultimately, and this is not the complaint. U.S. ultimately has to care for its own interests first and foremost. Every nation should care for its own interests. So now, at a certain point, U.S. throughout history had a vested interest to have this ally of Israel in the Middle East. Why? It gives it a presence there. Now, but these interests have changed and could change. And therefore, just because at one point of time, U.S. says, do this, and we'll give you this promise, does not mean that is going to happen. And many times the U.S. will renege on their promises. Let me give you 2 examples of promises the U.S. made, one to Israel, one not to Israel, where because things change, things happened on the ground. The first one is in 1956. After the Sinai War, the U.S. promised Israel that, and the U.S. was trying to get Israel to pull back and to retreat from the Sinai and from Gaza. They told them that if the Straits of Tiran were ever going to be blocked again, they would come to their defense. That was the promise in 1956. 1967, they did it, and America did not come to Israel's defense. Again, this is not even necessarily blaming the U.S. because the situation on the ground, politically, whatever it is, may have changed. They have to do what's in its best interest. In 1956, they had one interest. In the 1967, there was a different interest. But the point is, Israel should not be twisting itself in a pretzel to be going to the demands of a certain demand right now, because who says that demand or that promise they're going to give is going to remain? Again, Well, let me give you another example. It's not connected to Israel, but we see the idea that not always promises are kept. Here's another one, and again, let's try to remain non-political for the rest of the class. Now, everyone, you may be familiar with the 1994 the Budapest Memorandum, which what was that? That Ukraine was pushed to give up all its nuclear weapons, and they had the third largest stockpile of nuclear weapons at that point. And they were told that if you give it up, you will have security. You will have promises that if Russia encroaches on you, we will come to your defense. We will actually have we will give you security assurances, and we will actually come and fight the war with you. What happened? We all know the rest of the story. They gave it up, and their territory was encroached. And while they are getting a lot of money, what they said in the agreement did not come to place. Again, this is not blaming anyone. Things may have changed because a country has to worry about its own best interest. But here's the point: that should also include Israel. Israel should also have the right to worry about its own self-interest, and they have to look out for itself, and they should not compromise on security to make another country happy, even if that's the U.S. Because we have to recognize that U.S. has to look out for itself, and part of U.S. looking out for itself generally is making sure being a partner with Israel, an ally with Israel, but Israel also has to look out for itself, and its security comes for its. What? Okay. Now, here's what comes, the third and most important. I think the most important. And that is when Israel ultimately, U.S. wants to have a strong partner in the Middle East. And when Israel stands up for itself and for its security needs, in the long run, this will help out the U.S. as well, and they will respect us more. Because even if now they're pressuring us, but when they see in the long run, and again, maybe now it may be going against what the U.S. wants, but in the long run, Israel, the stronger Israel is, militarily, politically, and in their positions, this will help out their allies. And therefore, when Israel is able to put a line in the sand and say, this we can't budge on because this puts our strength into play, this weakens us, that will weaken its allies as well, including the U.S. Let me give an example for this. Let me give a very clear example for this. In 1967, Israel fought the Six-Day War using the weapons from, anyone knows which countries? Primarily, the French and the British, not U.S. weapons. That was, again, primarily was using tanks and missiles from the French and the British. What happened after victory? The U.S. came running for arms. When the U.S. saw that Israel didn't give in to the demand and was strong and had this victory, showed strength, then we got the respect, and now international wants to do deals with them. The U.S. says, we see a strong ally here. Now it's in our benefit to be strong. Now, again, in 67, before, the U.S. was getting a lot of pressure. Don't preemptively attack. Don't do this. But when they saw strength, when Israel did not cave into pressures, ultimately, this gained the international respect and the respect of the USA. Now, what's ironic and unfortunate is that even though this was so clear, again, they only got the arms until after. Unfortunately, this is probably the last time that Israel, in its fullest way, completely stood up for itself. From 67, they're constantly bending and getting into international pressures. And again, hopefully, God willing, maybe now things will change. And God, but throughout, go to any war in the past 50 years, and one after the next. They came to the point, Israel gave into this demand, gave into this pressure, and it's almost like they did not learn their lesson. The Rebbe would often say, as you see, that was speaking hidden. But every so often, that would sprinkle in English words. And that would very often say that Israel is constantly trying to be, say English, a good boy. trying to run around, being a good boy to America and trying to please America when it goes against its security interests. And it's almost like the U.S. is saying, putting pressure, we want you to compromise, but in the truth is the U.S. wants Israel to be strong. And when Israel acts in Israel's self-best interest, that is what secured his victory in the Six-Day War. And that's what caused the strategic alliance with the U.S. because strength is respected. Now, and again, we recognize many times nations have to say certain things. And again, it's not even getting political. And this is, again, many times nations have to, because of the vested interest, have to say something, but it does not mean you always have to listen to what the nation is saying if it's going against your self-interest. And again, the point we're saying over here is, even though at that time it maybe seemed very tough to not to cave, but in the long run, the nation is putting pressure on you will be happier if you are strong in the long run. And if you don't give in for your security demands and you become weaker, Israel being weaker makes U.S. weaker because, again, U.S. needs Israel to be strong. This is their ally in the Middle East. And therefore, it's a vested interest for America, for U.S. to have a strong ally. So let's summarize. And again, the first point is, in the long term, Israel needs to be more self-sufficient. They should not rely on other nations. The second idea is Israel should not take the U.S.'s demand so seriously because even the U.S. doesn't always absolutely stand by its commitments. The third idea is that Israel is a partner when it's a strong partner. And therefore, the first and foremost thing is recognizing we will get more respect and more alliances when we are strong and don't give in for our security. And all this means that Israel cannot compromise when it comes to security. Yes, you may be promised this piece, that piece, that. You're going to give up land, or you're going to give up positions. You're going to say, we're going to make a ceasefire, which is going to cause more loss of life on both sides, as we mentioned last week. In the long run, not only is it going to compromise the security, but even in the international alliances, it's going to weaken that because it's going to make Israel weaker. Israel weaker makes our alliances also weaker. Let's take a look at the next video. Okay, so this is the next idea. The danger of giving in concession is it weakens you, it weakens the nation, And ultimately that is goes against the self-interest of Israel, even when it comes to our alliances. The question is where we go. Yeah.
Why is like the head of Mossad, the IPF, the ones that are negotiating with Hamas in Cairo right now, and why are they willing to concede? And the only one that's standing strong is Netanyahu saying no.
This is not really about what I don't want this to evolve into is pointing fingers at certain politicians or not or this politician, that one. It's not a very easy place for someone to be in because there is a lot of pressure. What we're saying is the Torah's view, and the Torah's view. I just want to say something, and maybe I didn't make this clear. Torah's view is not that you can never make a compromise. You can never, but it's only if it does not come in the way of our security. Sometimes compromises, maybe certain, let's say, loan agreements or money is not coming in the face of our, maybe talking about humanitarian aid. Again, I'm not a military expert, so I can't say. It's not for me to say. Even if I have thoughts about it, it's not for me to judge when is this going to be go into the place of security. But as we spoke about last week,
every Shabbat.
So
evening.
Again, but
you have tens of thousands of people there that are demonstrating and against Netanyahu.
Listen,
election.
I don't want to get into the political aspect right now. What's happening in Israel? I'm sure very complicated. However, what I did, and last week we spoke about this, was mistakes have been made, and this is not about a specific administration. This goes across party lines. Mistakes have constantly been made in Israel, and the hope is that Israel Israel will have that ability to take these ideas, and the more it's brought out to the public, hopefully, the more Israel will be able to stand strong. So, I want to take this a little bit. I want to finish off with one important with one important concept. This will hopefully touch on the idea of our messaging, also when it comes to the idea of anti-Semitism as well. So, the question is, where do we go from here? What is the message we need to take from here? So the first idea is we need to know this truth. We need to know this truth. We need to be confident about this truth. That our security overrides all of us. But sometimes, again, as we said, many times people won't necessarily take to this. So in 1982, this was the Rebbe was having his 80th birthday. And Israel always had a all the politicians, and again, this crosses party lines. Israel always had a very strong respect for the Rebbe, recognizing, the Rebbe's love for Israel, and there was knowledge, and they would constantly send prime ministers, presidents, and for the Rebbe's 80th birthday, they sent the then ambassador Yitzhak Rabin, who then was an ambassador. Later, he becomes the prime minister of Israel. But they sent him to have an audience with the Rebbe, again, wishing him as a symbol of respect and wishing the Rebbe 80. They had a conversation. And they focus on a certain verse in the Torah. So let me give you a little historical background of this verse. A couple of weeks ago, in the Torah reading, we read in Parshas Balak. We read the story of Balak going to hire Bilam, who was a non-Jewish prophet, and to go curse the Jewish people. He had his ability to bless and to curse. And ultimately what happened was that all the curses gets turned to blessing. And he wants to curse them, but ultimately it all gets turned to blessing. Now there's one verse over there, which seems, again, compared to all the other blessings, seems maybe a little bit out of place. Take a look at text number 8, page 23. Behold, it is a people that dwells alone, and it is not reckoned amongst the nation. Again, a nation that dwells alone. Now, does this sound like a blessing or a curse? So, it almost sounds like a curse. They're alone. They're not reckoned amongst the nation. It sounds like this is a negative. However, we know that Bilam was saying blessings. He wasn't saying curses. So how was this a blessing? And the way the Rebbe spoke to Rabin was, we have to recognize that it is a blessing to be able to have the courage to stand alone, even if everyone else is saying or doing something. But if it is the right thing to do, to stand alone shows on a certain courage and a certain blessing. This is a message I tell my kids all the time. Teachers tell their students, Just because everyone else is doing something does not make that right, does not make that what you should do. And very often, the wrong thing, the wrong behavior is what's popular, and it takes a lot of courage not to give in to the peer pressure. Let's think about a child in school, to be able to stand for what's right, even if you're alone. And this message is the message that everyone wanted to communicate is that ultimately Israel is oftentimes going to have to stand alone. And sometimes as Jewish people, we have to stand alone. Sometimes we're not going to be the most popular person, the most popular nation, but when we recognize there is a certain God-given right. Now let's talk about our security. Torah tells us we have to be first and foremost care about our security. Now, just because everyone in the world telling us to do something, everyone is saying, this is what you should do, concede over here, do this. If this goes against our security, then we have to stand alone. Bilam says the nation that stands alone and has the ability to stand alone. This is a blessing. We have to take to this. And this is such an important idea. We can't be scared about being alone, about going against the pressures of the world. And again, this is even when we're living over here. You yourself, going against the tide. I'm scared to be different. Remember Bilam's blessing. This is a nation that has the ability to stand alone. Let's take a look at the next video.
It started by the question that was put to me by the rabbi. Aren't you feel alone as the representative of the Jewish state among 120 countries and peoples that are represented in Washington? From this beginning, the rabbi had started to deal with the question, Am Levada Yishkon, what has kept the people of Israel always, little bit alone, by choice, or by outside origin. It's by the people. First, by our own choice, by the Jewish people's own choice, to be what they are, to speak to the Torah, to the faith, to the tradition of the Jewish people for 2,000 years, without a stone, as option of one, not after all of them. And regardless to all this, the Jewish people remain faithful to the Jewish religion and succeeded to survive for no people anywhere in the world food to be successful.
So this is the message. Sometimes sometimes Israel is going to have to act alone for its best interest. Now, it's ironic, it's unfortunate, is that when Rabin becomes prime minister in 1992, what does he say? I'm going to quote him. He says, Rabin announces that, again, this was the beginning of his second term. He says, Israel is no longer a people that dwells alone and has to join the global journey towards peace, reconciliation, and international cooperation. So he almost forgot the message. And what happened shortly afterwards? Concession. He giving up land and concession because ultimately, and again, this is not to blame him. Again, this is not to point fingers at anyone or any, but ultimately, when who can blame someone? People want to be liked. People want to be respected, and no one wants to be alone. But here's the question: are we willing to stand alone, to do what's right for our security? And although he said we're no longer alone, the Torah respectfully disagrees. The Torah says we will always remain alone. This is part of our destiny as Jewish people. And again, it's a double-edged sword. But Bilam was saying there's a blessing over here. Because if we don't protect Jewish lives, no one will. What happened when we relied on international help for our protection in 1939, 46 million people later. Again, this is, and when we're proud of this, when we're proud of our security, ultimately the world will come around and respect us as we saw in 1967. So the takeaway we have to do is we have to be confident. And the truth is, I want to speak a little bit about anti-Semitism, because so many people today, what's the worry is the anti-Semitism as well. And the truth is, I think this message about standing alone and standing strong is so important when we discuss hatred, because so many people think, and too many people think, that what is the best way to combat anti-Semitism is blending in. Don't make your Judaism so noticeable. Try to blend in with everyone else. Don't stand alone. Don't stand. And that didn't either work historically. Historically, when Jewish people try to, because of anti-Semitism, we're going to hide who we are. They found us anyway. Ultimately, if we want to be able to stand in the face of anti-Semitism, the best antidote is to stand strong, stand confidently, recognize maybe we have to do this alone. But when we stand strong, when we stand alone, so to say, the world respects us. As former Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks says, non-Jews respect Jews that respect themselves. They respect their religion. Non-Jews don't respect Jews that don't respect who they are. As long as we're trying to do it to someone else, they'll sniff it from a mile away. And the best way to be strong in the face of anti-Semitism is be prouder of who we are, be stronger who we are, be more confident in who we are. I'm going to finish off with one last video.
Again, I coordinate the God of the God community in country. Again, the God of the next organization, so the Canadians and Baptists do the Canadians together, the Canadians the great hero, and the Canadians the great Baptist, the photo, the community, the guns, your own 29. And the strategy is that the when the Congregation the leaders have two different directions and are not even getting commanded. And also there's a part of saying, but then I leave the news to go, but then I leave them taking my road to we can take our road to the city. But in Jason our road is very easy. When David, when all the churches on the people for very that going from the place of that side. Media, anemia, the doctor, and that la loca nella caragna di la stima, o nella vicina di turbine del futuro, dai punti con la nostra immagine di piccolo che diventa ogni volta. Non c'è loca per gli stranieri, l'hanno dato.
Too often, we try to hide who we are. We try to, again, put on, as I said, try to polish the wall. Try to put on this. It's not being true to who we are. It's not being true to our identity. When we're strong in who we are, when we show our authenticity, then we don't act like victims. We act like we're proud of. We recognize our right to be who we are and are recognized to exist. Our security ideas. Then we are respected. And this paradigm, they are brought in so many areas. Again, not just with regards to Israel. The idea of Jewish pride. One of the famous things, especially now other organizations do as well, one of the famous things that ever instituted was Lag BaOmer. Okay? When Lag BaOmer, especially when it fell on Sunday, whoever would have bused thousands, you may have seen videos, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of public school children to Paradise. They would close up on the streets. And these children, Jewish children, again, not religious at all. They would go marching. They would have the signs. They would go part of marching that they're Jewish. And again, what was the idea over here? To be proud of who we are. To be proud. And ultimately, this is the best way. We have to stand alone. Ultimately, once we stand alone, the ironic thing is, when we try to be with everyone else, then we'll be alone. When we stand alone, in other words, when we stand for what's right, then they'll join us, then they'll respect us, then they'll make those alliances with us. So just to recap, this seminar, we'll finish a little early today. The first and most, as we spoke about last week, the first and foremost important idea is our security securing our lives. That's the first consideration. That is, as we mentioned, the most important value in Torah. There is no value that comes to saving one life. Nothing. No land, no this. Everything is about our protecting lives. Once we know that, then we recognize what our security needs are, how to start a war, how to end a war, what our strategic needs are. And that's what we have to implement. Now, how do we deal with the pressures that come with that? So there's a few ideas. First of all, being certain what our claim to the land is. Our claim to the land is not 76 years old. Our claim to the land is thousands of years old. Yes, we think that the UN 1948 gave us a modern state, and we're grateful for all that, and that's part of the claim. But again, it goes beyond that. Once we're certain about our claim to the land, so then we have to recognize that the more we can see, the weaker we show, the more pressure we'll build. How to deal with pressure that comes from an ally that can support, recognizing that their commitments change. Don't be so scared of what they have to say, and recognizing that they will benefit from us being strong. And ultimately, when we're strong, and sometimes it goes, we have to be alone. We have to stand alone. We have to be alone. We have to be, Abraham. But yesterday by our Sunday breakfast, we spoke a lot about Abraham. What was Abraham called? Abraham Ivri, Abraham the Jew. Now, why is he called the Ivri? So it mentions the Talmud, Ivri also means a side. The whole world was standing on one side, and he was one small voice standing on the other side, standing for the idea of morality, truth, for God. And ultimately, look what Abraham created. Not just the Jewish nation. All religions come from Abraham, because sometimes you have to be that one voice. Sometimes in the face of hate, in the face of pressures, we have to be that one voice of light and truth in this world. It doesn't say it over here, but speaking about politicians, we mentioned Rabin, we mentioned Sharon last week, but let's speak about Netanyahu for a moment. Netanyahu, he always speaks about this. He met the UN, one of his speeches to the UN. He said that before he was a prime minister, when he was first appointed as an ambassador for Israel. And anyone knows what when he was appointed ambassador? Anyone knows the year? I believe it was maybe in the 70s, late 70s. And he says he came to Crown Heights. It was a custom by Simchas Torah. Israeli politicians would go to the Rebbe, and they would dance to the Rebbe, they would speak to the Rebbe, and he comes there. He's a young person, just became ambassador, and he was brought up to the Rebbe, and ultimately him and the Rebbe have a 45-minute talk. And there's tens of thousands of Hasidim waiting and dancing, but he has a talk. And he says that the Rebbe told me as follows. You repeated this tens of times. You Google Bibi Netanyahu Lubavitch Rebbe, and it'll come up, a YouTube of him saying it. He said, the Rebbe told me that you are now going to the UN, and the UN is a dark place, a place of lies. And recognize your mission is to be that one candle, that one light of truth. And recognize the candle spreads. A light spreads, gives light, and is able to take away darkness. In 2014, he gave a speech in the UN. I don't know if you remember, that was when he brought the red line for Iran, and he mentioned this. During that speech, he said, "I'm here," and the Lubavitch Rebbe told me to be that voice of truth. And ultimately, this message we have to know when it comes to our own lives, when it comes to how we project ourselves to the world, both how Israel projects itself to the world, how we project. We have to be strong, and once we're strong, ultimately we'll be respected. May Hashem give the wisdom and the clarity to the leaders of Israel and to all of us to be able to know this truth and to live by this truth.
Amen.
All right. Okay, thank you. Thank you for joining.